today. Well, with all the big news about lately, you'd be forgiven for not hearing a rather extraordinary legal decision that was handed down in September. But it was published this Wednesday, which is how I know about it, and which in essence opens the way for voluntary voting, I think, to be made legal. Now, of course, without a very good excuse, the powers that be are pretty keen to fine us if we fail to vote in federal, state or council elections, and I got this firsthand recently because I didn't vote in the council election and I had to pay the $50-something. But what if you simply don't want to vote? What if when you look at the list of candidates on offer in your electorate, you don't fancy any of them and what they stand for? Well, shouldn't that be a good enough excuse to abstain from voting? As I've said before, surely the ultimate democratic exercise is having the right to vote, but also having the right to ignore it. Well, until now, the simple answer to all of that's been no. You've certainly got to turn up. You don't have to technically vote, but you've got to turn up to have your name ticked off. Otherwise, they fine you. But in a New South Wales local court judgment from Magistrate David Helipern, a certain Adam Easton has successfully relied on a section of the Commonwealth Electoral Act concerning religious freedom to avoid being fined after refusing to vote in the 2016 federal election. Now, not wanting to make it more complicated than it need be, this is a legal thing, but in a nutshell, this Easton fellow is an agnostic, but he convinced the magistrate, instead of believing in God, that he believed in freedom, and that freedom formed the basis of his moral framework and view on life, and so he got off. Now, this is a first, as I said before. I wonder if it sets a true legal precedent here for more of us here who don't want to be forced to vote and escape a fine. Well, someone who's consistently championed a libertarian view in these sort of matters and others is Senator David Leyonhjelm, and he's on the line. Nice to catch up, Senator.
Good afternoon.
I reckon you'd be pretty pleased with this little decision, eh?
I was pretty chuffed. Yes, it's nice to see. Not even I call liberty or freedom a religion or equivalent to a religion, but I was pretty pleased to see this guy succeed with that argument. It was unfortunately just a magistrate's court, so it's not binding on other courts, and you wouldn't be able to use it as a precedent. But if the government was to appeal and it went to a higher court, that might become a binding precedent, so that'd be pretty interesting.
Well, I mean, you and I think, are of the same mindset here. I think that the franchise of vote, the voting franchise, should be extended to as many people as possible, certainly above the age of 18. All citizens should have the right to vote, but within that great liberty and that great extension of liberty should also surely be the right to say, well, thanks for that, but on this occasion I don't want to use it.
Oh, absolutely. I totally agreed with the argument the guy offered. It's against my conscience to actually be forced to vote, and I'm totally on board with that. In fact, Australia is really unusual in the world in requiring people to vote. Most countries, nearly all other countries, as a matter of fact, that are democratic, have optional voting. And the point about it, of course, is that not only do the candidates and the parties have to convince you to vote for them, they have to convince you to vote at all. And that's an extra step, and it puts the onus on them to convince you that there's something worth voting for.
I've been a bit cheeky in the past asking government ministers and opposition MPs and the like whether the fact that voting is compulsory in this day and age has anything to do with the fact that for every vote above about 4% of the primary vote, the parties get $2.64 or whatever it is. They've sort of chuckled politely, which I take as a yes. Is that how you interpret the compulsory voting today? There's several arguments I get when I push this optional voting, voluntary voting idea in Canberra. That's one, the funding, although most of the candidates, it must be said, most of the MPs are removed from the operations of their parties. They really don't know much about that. Most of them have no idea how they got elected, as a matter of fact, once they get pre-selected. but they also, nearly all of them push back against the idea of optional voting because for somehow or other they think that they're going to be the losers. The Labor Party thinks that there'll be more people vote for the Liberals or the Conservative side, and the Conservative side say, well, we couldn't convince our lot that we weren't going to lose votes to Labor. And there are individual politicians who will say, well, I totally agree with you, Australia is out of step with the rest of the world. But get them to say it in public and get them to advocate it, nigh on impossible, I'm afraid. It seems to be the case, doesn't it? On the issue of, just before I go back to compulsory voting or voluntary voting, David, on the issue of what's been going on with all this dual citizenship saga in the Senate, of course, in the lower house more particularly, we've had to have by-elections. Speaking about the money that parties get for votes, can you confirm that it is, or maybe deny, that it is the case that obviously, say a candidate like Barnaby Joyce, by virtue of all the votes he got back at the 2016 election, earned for the National Party X amount of dollars through the votes for, money kind of arrangement that exists. You have a by-election. Well, first you have a court cost, which is funded by the taxpayer. You then have a by-election through the AEC, which is again bankrolled by the taxpayer. And then, because parties get X amount of votes, they then get another stipend from the AEC as if they would have got in a normal election, because you get votes, you get money. Is that the case? In essence, they almost double dip.
That's exactly right. They pretty much do double dip, so you get $2.64 or something, as you said, per vote once you get over 4%.
So in essence, sorry to cut you off, Dave, but in essence, Barnaby Joyce got, let's say, $100,000 for the Nationals, roughly speaking, back in 2016 for all the votes he got back then.
Yes.
Found ineligible. The National Party didn't have to pay any of that money back because the AEC says, no, we can't force you to do that. The taxpayer funds the court cost. The taxpayer funds the by-election. We have the vote, and then he gets again for the National Party about another $100,000 a year later.
That's exactly right.
All paid for by the taxpayer.
That's exactly correct. All paid for by the taxpayer. I hate this public funding of political parties. I really hate it. And yet, you have plenty of people out there who are saying, no, parties shouldn't accept any donations. It should all be public funded. It makes my skin crawl. It really does. All this money being handed out to political parties in this way, and as you say, double dipping. It's a terrible thing. I will defend funding Barnaby's legal costs. I don't think it was his fault that the High Court decided that the High Court decided that he was in breach of Section 44. Until the High Court said we're going to take a totally literal view of Section 44.1 and read it exactly as it's written, with no interpretation, no consideration for what it was intended to be when it was written in 1900. I don't think you can blame Barnaby. The likelihood is there's fewer dual citizens in the Australian Parliament now than there ever has been in history. It's just that this issue has blown up now.
Well, there's certainly fewer now. That about 12 have been kicked out.
That's right. Yes, there are a few less now as well. Exactly right.
You'd hope there's fewer.
But the $2.64 per vote, once you get over 4%, it's a racket, absolute racket. The major parties get millions. I think from memory it's about 20-odd million each. It's just dreadful. Yeah.
Look, you're talking to someone here who's not against public funding of campaigns to get rid of the sort of the donation for favours model, but we agree certainly on that issue of the money for votes.
I'm on the Joint Standing Committee on Electoral Matters. We've had an inquiry into a running inquiry into donations, and it's really interesting because we've called witnesses and listened to read submissions and all that sort of stuff on donations. And over and over and over again, we get people saying, donations are a problem, they've got to be controlled, managed. Foreign donations are really, really bad. And then when I or one of the other members of the committee say, OK, now what's the evidence for that? It's being said over and over and over again, but what is the evidence for that? It's really, really very thin. There are actually very, very few foreign donations that have ever been made. Obviously, foreign donations got Sam Dastyari into trouble, but what did the Chinese get for their money is the question. They didn't change Labor Party policy, even if they changed Sam's policy. So, I really think this fuss over donations is misplaced.
Are we right to call them donations, though, or not to push the point, but in essence, particularly for big business or a high-net individual in business, be they Australian or foreign, give to a political party, they're not really donating, they're investing, aren't they, really?
Well...
and they want a return on their investment.
Well, yeah, except that if you actually say to them, are you expecting the recipient of the money to change their policy, or do you just want them to keep doing what they're doing? I've never heard anybody say anything other than the latter. They want them to keep doing what they're doing. I mean, the Liberal Democratic Party, my party, got hundreds of thousands of donations at the last election, prior to the last election, and we've had quite a few since then, obviously. Not one of the donors has said we want you to change your policy on anything. They like the fact that we are in favour of low taxes, less regulation, less red tape, getting the government out of off your back and out of your pocket. And they just say, keep doing what you're doing. We wish you could do more of it. Here's some money. Hopefully you will be able to keep going. I actually don't think the donors to the Liberals or the Labor Party or even the Greens expect them to do anything different.
Just finally, on the issue of voting then, David, let's go back to where we started.
Yes.
Do you ever envisage a day when Australians will have the right to vote, but equally have the right not to exercise it without the risk of financial penalty?
Yes, I can envisage a situation. It would require a bit of bravery, and there's not much of that around.
No, it's thin supply.
But yes, I could envisage a government that felt very confident about its political support, and it said, look, it's Australia that's out of step with the rest of the world. Let's have the proper democracy and allow people to choose whether or not to vote, and if they do choose to vote, then they choose who to vote for as well. That's what other countries do, and that is true democracy. What we've got is forced democracy.
I agree with you. I reckon a whole bunch of people agree. We'll find out now. David, thanks for your time. Have a Merry Christmas.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
That's Senator David Leyonhjelm there from the Liberal Democrats.